Hello, I'm Brendan. I work for the Central Park Conservancy. Welcome to Central Park. The Central Park Conservancy is the nonprofit who takes care of Central Park year-round. Because getting to Central Park is not an option for so many, we here at the Conservancy want to bring the park to you. We do that through a series of lunchtime strolls every Wednesday at 12:30. Today we're going to be walking through the Seneca Village landscape. Now, this was a tough weekly walk to create. This is such an important place in the park, and it has an incredible history. And I went back and forth as to what to include and what to leave out. And I guarantee you that some of you are going to say, I wish there was more history. And some of you are going to say, I wish there were more trees, but I am just one man. So what today really is a taste of this incredible landscape. And throughout the program, I'm going to give you more resources so that you can go and explore on your own. We're going to be together probably a little bit longer than our usual 15 minutes, but if you've attended a weekly walk with me before, you know that I'm actually not great with time, so that might be no surprise. For those of you who might be new to these walks, I saw in the chat that we've got a few people for whom this is their first. We started these in April, and we started them really to show folks what the park looks like as the season changes. And so we're seeing the park in real time. All the photos that you're going to see today were taken by me in the last week. And of course, we're going to stop and look at some of the trees and the things that are blooming right now in the park. Before we move any further, I want to do a little housekeeping. Oh, I was supposed to click this. There we go. Now we've started. So you can use the chat feature on your Zoom control bar to say hello and comment, which so many of you already have. Hello, hello. And you can use the Q&A feature that you can also find on your control bar to answer any questions that you might have. My colleagues Juan and Jose, they are on the back end, Juan and Ian and Jose are on the back end right now, and they're going to be answering questions as we go. You're going to be invited to participate in some polls as well, and I will launch them. You'll vote, and then they'll go away, and I'll share the results after everyone has voted. So I'm going to actually launch the first poll now. I just want to know if any of you are actually familiar with Seneca Village. So you're going to see this pop up, vote, and I'm going to share the results in just a little bit. I'm just curious if this is your first time hearing about it, or maybe if you know a little bit, or maybe you are an expert. And if so, welcome to all. Okay, so today's walk is really about layers, the layers of history that exist in one single landscape. And to start, we're going to peel back a few of those layers. I want to give you a very brief history of this really incredible part of the park, and we're going to head back to 1862 to do that. Okay. We've arrived in 1862. Welcome, I'm glad you made it. This is a photo from that year, and it's looking down south from 102nd Street. And although this photo was taken 4 years after the creation of Central Park had started, it was still a long time before the north end was really going to be designed and completed. This is our chance to look at the land really before Central Park was the Central Park that we know today. You know, it was hilly and it was rocky, and there were low-lying marshes and swamps, and there's an occasional tree here and there. In no way, shape, or form is this the Central Park that we know today. Now, there's a common misconception that Central Park was built on empty, barren land, and that the rocks and the hills and the marshes actually prevented people from making their homes there. And if you look at this image, you can kind of understand why people might say that. However, that misconception, it really erases the fact that people did make their homes here. And they really had for generations. Roughly 1,600 people lived on the land that would become Central Park. They were immigrants and factory workers and African Americans, and there were even some wealthier individuals. Here's a different view of the land. Okay. This is the map from 1856. It was created by one of the original Central Park engineers. His name was Egbert Villet. And it shows the topography of the land pre-Central Park. And on this map, you can see those huge rock outcroppings. They're the little shaded circles and shapes. And you can also see roads that crisscross the landscape. And if you zoom in, you can also see some buildings. the fanciest PowerPoint move I've ever done. So we're now looking at a little section of this map, and it's a section of the park on the west side. If you look at the zoomed out portion, you can see there's tiny squares in there. Well, you can't tell what they are from this map, but we know that those are mainly houses and sheds. There's also a few churches in there as well. And this was the most densely populated area of the pre-Central Park. This is Seneca Village. So it sat roughly between 82nd and 89th Street, between 7th and 8th Avenue. And the community began in 1825 when an African-American man named Andrew Williams moved up here and purchased 3 plots of land for his family. Now, in 1855, so 30 years later, there were roughly 225 individuals who lived in roughly 52 houses in this area. There were 3 churches, and there was a school as well, and a number of burial grounds. Now, roughly 2/3 of this population was African-American. The other third was European immigrant, primarily, and about half of the African-American population owned their land, which is a really significant part of this story that we'll talk more about in just a little bit. So by all accounts, Seneca Village was a thriving community by the mid-19th century. And then the inevitable question is, what happened? On July 21st of 1853, so that's actually 167 years ago yesterday, New York State set aside roughly 750 acres for the country's first major public park. As this document states, the opening and laying out of a public place between 59th and 106th Street and 5th and 8th Avenue. This process was done through eminent domain, meaning the government seized the land, they compensated the residents, and then they developed it for public use. It was not the first time that eminent domain had been used in New York, certainly wouldn't be the last, and the residents had until the fall of 1857 to leave the land. And that means that families who had created lives for themselves were now uprooted, and some of these families after nearly 30 years of ownership. The following year, in 1858, ground was broken on Central Park. Now, we all know that the story is so much richer and so much more complicated than that, than the summary that I've just given you, but we're going to keep pulling back those layers as we go. And as I said, I'm going to provide resources for you and share information about what the Conservancy and other organizations are doing to commemorate this site. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. So I hope that by the end of this, you're curious and you'll go and explore a little bit more. So where are we walking today? The Seneca Village site sits between 82nd and 89th, and that's basically where we're going to walk. We're going to enter at 81st Street. We're going to head up toward the 86th Street Traverse, and then we're going to make our way back down. Let's see, before we go any further, let's see where we are in regards to our knowledge. Okay, so it looks like about 39%, this is the first time hearing about it. About 51, you know a little bit about Seneca Village, and some of you know quite a lot. This is really exciting. It's really great to know that we're being able to introduce this story to folks who don't know about it, and also just continue to share the story and add perhaps a little bit more information to those who do. Thanks so much for voting on that. All right, before we set off on our walk, I actually want to launch one more poll. And so this is going to tell us how many of you have joined a live weekly walk before, and also how many of you have visited this particular area of Central Park. I'll share the results in just a little bit. So we're going to enter at 81st Street. Now the park is truly beautiful right now, and even though it's scorching hot here in New York City, we've had some really significant rain in the last few weeks, and as you can tell, the greenery really appreciates it. And we're going to walk down this path, and then we're going to stop at a sign here just in front of us. Now, last October, the Central Park Conservancy erected a series of 16 interpretive signs throughout the Seneca Village site. And you can see one of them right in front of us. The Conservancy created these with the help of a number of outside organizations, one of which I'll talk about in just a little bit. And the signs mark the sites of important buildings and features in the landscapes, and they tell stories of the residents, and they're chock full of information, and they have really cool primary sources on them. And so we're going to stop at just a few of these 16 signs today. But if you can go into the park in person, I encourage you to explore them. And if you can't, you can actually access all of these on our website. And one of my colleagues can actually drop the link in the chat now, but we'll make sure you get this in the follow-up email as well. So the park has been an oasis for so many people these past few months. And in front of us are a few people using one of these lawns as a gym. And this happens all year round, but we've definitely seen an increase in active recreation recently. I do want to say, if you do work out in Central Park, could you do us a favor and not tie anything to the trees? It's technically against the rules, and the trees really appreciate it. We're going to take a left here, and then we're going to move toward the highest natural point in Central Park. Now, there are a lot of ways to access Summit Rock, and I thought we'd take this little stone path today. Now, many of Central Park's landscapes, they're endowed, which means money has been set aside for their continued maintenance and care. And Summit Rock, this landscape is endowed as well. You can barely see the rock in the shadow here, but there's a plaque on that rock, and it says that this endowment is dedicated to Betsy Barlow Rogers, who's actually the first president of the Central Park Conservancy. We're going to stroll up this pathway, and then we're going to look at some of the greenery as we go. Up, up, up we go. I'm going to end the poll and share the results from our second poll real quick. Looks like about 58% have joined us or have visited the area before, excuse me. A few of us have not joined or visited the area, which is great. And we've got a lot of folks for whom have seen these weekly walks before, and some newcomers. We do these every week, so if you are new, we hope to see you again next week. Central Park has an incredible array of native and non-native plants. And this is a horrible picture of one of the native varieties. This is called black cohosh. You can actually find this in the grocery store. It is a dietary supplement, the root is, and it manages hot flashes and menopause. Now, this is a close-up. It's not really better than the zoomed out shot, but it looks a little bit like a pipe cleaner, and you can see that clearly now here. Black cohosh was actually also used by Native American communities. And really because so much of our walk today is about the landscape prior to the creation of Central Park, I also want to acknowledge that all of Central Park and all of Manhattan, and actually all of New York City, it sits on the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape. And the name Manhattan actually comes from the Lenape. Mannahatta, it meant island of many hills. We're going to continue climbing up this hill. We're going to head up the path, and we're going to go up a staircase that was actually carved into the rock during the park's construction. And as you wander through Central Park, the rocks are really the best place to see evidence of the park's design. And once you know what to look for, you're going to see it everywhere. And we've made it to the top. This is the top of Summit Rock. And Summit Rock is a really prominent feature in the landscape. It's 142 feet above sea level and the highest natural point in Central Park. And this is a view that looks west toward the Hudson River. And this is the view that looks west toward the Hudson River from roughly 1850. This is not Seneca Village that we're looking at. That's in a different direction, but this does give you an idea of how populated or unpopulated this area of New York was around this time period. And it also gives you kind of a fun depiction of some of these humongous rocks that jut out of the earth. I want to go back to our favorite map. You can actually see Summit Rock in this map. It's the very big rock just below 83rd Street. I think you can see my cursor right here. Now, during the years when Seneca Village was thriving, there's no evidence that anybody lived up here, and you can understand why. There's a pretty significant elevation. However, I'm sure people did climb up here to take in the views. Now, this high point, in addition to the other high points in the park, They were used by the designers, Frederick Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. So we see Summit Rock here, and we can also see Summit Rock here. They turned this into a lookout and a carriage turnaround. This is a map from early in the park's history. Now you're also going to see that at the bottom of this image, there's a very big rectangle. It's blue. That is a reservoir. We're not going to talk about this today, but we are going to go on a walk of the Great Lawn in a few weeks. So if you're curious about that reservoir, I encourage you to join us. The top of Summit Rock has this really beautiful tree canopy, and I want you to take note of the tree that's kind of directly in front of us, not the big one to the right, but the one that's standing straight up tall. We're going to head over there in a bit. Now, remember how I said that the rocks were a really great place to see the design of Central Park? Well, this rock bench is a really great example because it has not one, not two, not three, but 4 drill holes that were from the rock or from the drills when it was being quarried out of the earth. You're going to find drill holes and drill marks all over the place. Okay, if you joined us for the last weekly walk, we were at the pool at 100th Street. I talked about a black locust tree. And we at the Central Park Conservancy really love the black locust because its wood is really rot resistant, and that's what we build our rustic benches out of, and really our rustic furniture, our rustic bridges. I also mentioned that there's a very easy way to tell the difference between a black locust and a hunting locust. Now, this one looks like a black locust, but if we get closer, we notice really insane thorns. So the honey locust tree generates these thorns all the way up the trunk, and then also they spread out across the branches. Honey locusts have been in the park since the very beginning because Frederick Olmsted thought they had a cool tropical vibe, and so they were planted very early on in the park's construction. I totally support hugging trees. I would just advise that you find a different one. All right. You can see our route. The little person is showing us where we've been, and you can see that we're heading down Summit Rock, and I want to stop by some really pretty flowers. Now, Central Park is famous for its spring blooms and its fall foliage, but you can really find beautiful color all year round. And while walking down the path, these lilies caught my eye. This is a close-up of that pink one. There are tons of different types of lilies, but regardless, the majority of them bloom in the summer and sometimes into the fall. And so you'll find them scattered throughout the park. Now, we're about to dig really deep into Seneca Village's history. So our next few stops, they are going to be some of the signs that are part of that larger signage exhibit. So we're standing roughly at 84th Street. The population of Seneca Village, as I mentioned, was predominantly African American, but records show that Irish Americans also lived scattered throughout the landscape. And this spot, there was a cluster of at least 3 Irish households. They were occupied by Mike Barlow, John Gallagher, and Jane Allen. Now, we don't know what these houses looked like because there are no photos of any houses within Seneca Village. And we also don't know if these particular folks owned their land. Many of the African American community did, but many of the Irish immigrants were arriving in the late 1840s and early 1850s, and perhaps didn't have enough time to generate the wealth necessary to make the purchase. So we do see a lot of renters. Even though we don't have pictures of the houses, we do have maps. This document is one of the most helpful historical documents that's used in the research for Seneca Village. And it's in part because it's one of the last documents created that depicts the community. This is a condemnation map. It was made by the government in 1856 to help them identify who owned what for the purposes really of compensation and eviction. And the red shapes are the structures, and then the rectangles are the plots of land, and each rectangle has a name and a number in it. Now, if you like historical documents, have I got a program for you? Next Wednesday, the Conservancy is partnering with the New York Historical Society, and we have a program on the pre-park landscape, and we're calling it Treasures from the Library, the Origins of Central Park. We're looking at documents like this one. The program is $10, and you can find more information on our website under the Specialty Programs tab. So if you do like these types of documents, I encourage you to check it out. My colleagues can drop a link in the chat as well. Now, before we go on, I actually want to draw your attention back to this map, and specifically to a building that's toward the top. It's the longer rectangle, so it's right here. We're going to zoom in on that spot, but to do that, I actually need to show you the 2020 map one more time. Okay, here's our route. We're approaching Spectre Playground. I'm going to pull the route off the map so we can zoom in here. You see this highlighted area? There's a red circle around it. And you see where the path kind of makes that little triangle of paths right by the playground, and then the pathway that curves below it. Well, here's that same map superimposed onto that condemnation map. And so you can see where the buildings were located in relation to where the pathways in the park are today. These are churches. Seneca Village had 3 churches, including All Angels Church, the African Union Church, and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, or the AME Zion Church. And it was actually the African Union Church that housed the school. I'm going to show you All Angels Church now. Now, there is only one known photo of a Seneca Village building. And that Seneca Village building sat basically right here in this spot. This is the site of All Angels Church. Now, much of the reporting from the 1840s and the 1850s, they call Seneca Village a shanty town, and they make it sound like it's just a collection of ramshackle buildings. But this is All Angels Church. It's a really beautiful and really substantial building. And this building really pushes against that narrative, the common narrative of the day, that this was kind of this remote outpost. Now, this church served the entire community, and there's records that show both Europeans and African Americans were married here, they attended services, they were buried here. And although this is the only photo that exists of a building that was in Seneca Village, this photo was taken when this building was no longer in Seneca Village. Prior to the eviction and the demolition of the buildings, the church leaders actually moved this church to 81st Street and 11th Avenues prior to that demolition. So right next to All Angels is a really, really great spot. This is another spot that has a sign, and I really love this spot. For one, I think it's really beautiful how these American elm trees make this canopy and really shade this kind of almost grove that we have here, this little glade. But further back behind these trees was the location of the Wilson House. It was adjacent to All Angels Church, and it was owned by William Wilson, and he lived in this house with his 8 kids and his wife. Now, people have been researching Seneca Village for years, and really since the early 1990s when there was a book published called The Park and the People that brought it back into the public consciousness. But there's one community organization that has really spearheaded a number of these projects. The group is called the Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History. It's a really cool organization. It's full of scholars and archaeologists, and their goal is to conduct further research and locate descendants, and also explore ways to commemorate the site in an educational context. And we've worked really closely with them over the past few years, including on this signage exhibit. Now, in 2011, the Institute conducted an archaeological dig of the Wilson House. Their findings were very cool. They found tons of artifacts. They found glassware, they found china, they found earthenware, and they found domestic products. That yellow handle in the top left corner of the grid, that is a part of a toothbrush. And on the far left, what that young woman is holding, that is a child's shoe. The dig also shed light onto how the houses were constructed. So even though we don't have images, we have a lot of information. We know from documents that the Wilson House was 3 stories, and researchers found what they believe to be the remains of a brick chimney, a hearth, and based on other architectural findings, they think that it had a stone foundation, a wooden floor, glass windows, and a metal roof. The long story short, it was incredibly substantial, really well built. And again, even without images, it's fair to say that this was not an anomaly, that many of the houses in Seneca Village are going to be similar. The artifacts and that home construction, they also point to another important aspect of this community. Some of the residents in this community, they were moving toward the middle class. So there's often a question as to why so much is here. Why is this particular site so rich with these artifacts? Well, when the land was being cleared, many of the buildings were taken down piece by piece, and some of that wood was actually reused in other structures. Sadly, the Wilson House, it looks as though it was actually just demolished. So it looks as though it was collapsed in on itself and then covered in dirt. And that really locked in the artifacts along with it. We don't know much about the final days of Seneca Village, but it's really tragic to think about a family moving into the middle class and then to find themselves, of course, in this situation. I want to show you another homestead, another one that's really, really important. So there's another sign here. This grassy knoll, it marks the site of the Andrew Williams home. Now, Mr. Williams, he was the first person to purchase land in Seneca Village, and he bought 3 plots in 1825. Now, remember, we're looking back into the early 19th century. He bought this land in 1825. New York State didn't abolish slavery until 1827. And as of 1821, the New York State Constitution required that free Black men hold $250 worth of property before they could vote. One of the many tools used to disenfranchise Black voters. The fact that Mr. Wilson, however, owned his property, and that so many other individuals in this community owned their property, probably means they could vote. And so Seneca Village was this means for political enfranchisement, for participation. And one of the reasons that we know so much about Mr. Williams, the fact that he lived in Seneca Village for 30 years, the fact that he owned all this land, is because of a petition. When he was forced from his home, Mr. Williams and a ton of other residents, they were kind of dismayed at the price that was put on their land. They thought that the surveyors undervalued them. And so he petitioned the government, and he said that his land was worth $4,000. He lived there for 30 years. It had appreciated. In the end, he was forced to leave with just about $2,300. Now, for so long, the story of Seneca Village, it kind of seemed to stop there. It stopped with eviction and with this broken china and these single shoes. But last year, the Conservancy, we had the opportunity to meet a descendant of the Williams family. She shared with us the story of her family, the legacy that stems from Andrew Williams being here in Seneca Village. And it's a story of pride and triumph. And we're going to drop that video in the chat, and then we'll also send it in the follow-up email. But it's really, really incredible. And it's a sign as to some of the new information that we're going to keep getting as we continue to explore this site. Okay. So we are going to cross over the drive, pop it to the Pinetum, head down toward one last topographical feature that would have been here during the time of Seneca Village. So we're walking along the edge of the Pinetum. We're going to stroll through this area in a few weeks, but I'm just going to give you a taste right now. The Pinetum, formerly the Arthur Ross Pinetum, was created in 1971 by a philanthropist and pine tree enthusiast. So from the 1970s into the 1980s, about 35 pines a year were planted in this area. And today there are about 17 different species of pines, and this area stretches from Seneca Village basically to the Met, so almost all the way across the park. These 2 stubby pines that you see in front, they are international. They're Japanese red pines. They're evergreen, so the red aspect doesn't come from the needles. It comes from the bark, which is bright red under the first initial layer. And you can see that the bark kind of chips away, exposing that red layer beneath it. We're now walking down the bridle trail, and we're headed south. And as we walk toward our final stop, I want to take a moment to really and ask you, or invite you more so, to just enjoy a virtual breath of fresh air. Because we're going to slowly cut across the drive and down a shaded path. We're on the way to the last stop. The last stop is called Tanner's Spring. It's another feature of that pre-park landscape that's still visible today. And if this was 1855, we'd be walking down a street appropriately called Spring Street. So you've got two documents here. On the left is a map that shows the streams in the low-lying areas. And on the right is a map that shows the various plots of land and their owners. And you can see there are red dots on each. So that's the location of Tanner's Spring, respective to the map. There were natural springs all over Central Park, but this is most likely the spring where residents of Seneca Village might have gotten their water. Now, I want you to look at the street that runs right down the middle of the document on the right. That is Spring Street. An important note, Tanner's Spring wasn't called Tanner's Spring during the 1850s. Wasn't actually called Tanner's Spring until the 1880s because there was a doctor named Henry Tanner, and allegedly he spent 40 days and 40 nights living off the water from springs in Central Park. So apparently our water is very nutritious. Now, Tanner's Spring, it's pretty hidden, and without the sign in the front that marks it, you might just miss it. It's tucked into a grove in the trees, and so we're going to turn right down that little dirt path. As we enter, we're going to see a shaded glade, and there's a small bench, and we can virtually take a seat on that bench and rest for a moment because we're almost done with this weekly walk. So Tanner's Spring, it's sort of like Tanner's Puddle. The water still flows, but by now it's more of a drip. Either way, there's usually a shallow pool here. And I personally think this is a really lovely space to reflect. Central Park, like most places, it's more than one thing. So it's a masterpiece of landscape design, and it's a true oasis for so many New Yorkers and travelers. And it's also the site of a thriving community of individuals who were forced from their homes. Multiple things can be true at once, but we shouldn't let one truth cover up the other. And so we here at the Conservancy, we're really proud that we get to work with so many community organizations and stakeholders to share the story of Seneca Village and really to share the story of Central Park, the whole story, and honor those who came before us. Interpretation is something that we're looking more at now, and we're really excited to continue this journey moving forward. And so that ends our weekly walk. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I encourage you to visit our website at centralparknyc.org/mycentralpark to find other ways you can stay connected to the Conservancy virtually. I encourage you to check out our program next week. I encourage you to come to the park and look at the signs or go on the website. I encourage you to read a little bit more about Seneca Village. Also, we're starting a slate of virtual tours. So every Tuesday at 3, we're doing deeper dives into some areas of Central Park, and you can locate information about that on our website as well. Next Tuesday, we're exploring the bridges and arches all across the park. We're also going to drop the video for that, or the link to that video that I mentioned in the chat, and you should check it out if you haven't seen it. I'm going to leave the room open just for a few minutes so we can grab any last questions, but I do hope to see you next week, or actually Ian hopes to see you next week, because it will be Ian walking you through the East Meadow. Until then, from the Central Park Conservancy, stay safe and be well.